In 2014, engineers made a strange and desperate choice. They decided to give a dead river a heartbeat. They opened the floodgates at the Morelos Dam, the very last barrier on the Colorado River, and released a surge of water into a channel that had been dry for 16 years. Not a leak, a deliberate, measured pulse. 105,392 acre-feet of water, sent to reclaim 50 miles of cracked, saline earth. 50 miles that separated a river from its own ocean. This was a billion-dollar experiment to see if you could resurrect an entire ecosystem with nothing more than water and hope. And for a moment, it worked. The river touched the sea. But this is not a story about a victory. This is a story about the bill coming due. Because the same river that was momentarily brought back to life is the sole water source for 40 million people across 7 states and 2 countries. Its largest reservoirs are now sitting just dozens of feet above failure. The foundational laws governing who gets water and how much are set to expire in less than 2 years. The states are at a stalemate, deadlocked in bitter negotiations. So what happens when a temporary miracle runs into a permanent math problem? Did we witness a river's rebirth? Or were we just watching the world's most expensive funeral procession? Let me know in the comments right now, before we go any further, what one thing you think could solve this. There are no wrong answers, just a crisis that needs ideas. Now, a lot of people watch these deep dives, get incredible value, and then completely forget to subscribe. If understanding the forces that are reshaping our world is important to you, you need to be here for what comes next. A huge percentage of our viewers aren't subscribed, meaning you'll miss the follow-ups to stories like this. Do us a favor and hit that button. It's a small click that makes a huge difference. Let's begin. For 6 million years, the Colorado River had one destination, the Gulf of California. It carved the Grand Canyon, nourished a vast network of life, and built one of the planet's great desert estuaries, a 19,300-acre wetland known as the Colorado River Delta, a place of such biological richness that the legendary naturalist Aldo Leopold described it as a land of 100 green lagoons. He wrote of jaguars roaming the cottonwood forests, of parrots and egrets so numerous they pestered the sky, of a river that met the sea in a majestic, sprawling embrace. That place is gone. Today, if you stand at that same spot in Baja California, at coordinates 31 degrees, 44 minutes north, 114 degrees 40 minutes west, you will not see 100 green lagoons. You will see a cracked, white, salt-blasted plain, a geological crime scene. The river no longer reaches its destination. It dies in the sand, sometimes 50, sometimes 90 miles short of the coast. Not just in a dry year, every year. Since the late 1990s, the connection has been severed. The Delta, starved of the fresh water that gave it life, has become a hypersaline wasteland. The roar of the river has been replaced by the sound of wind moving across baked mud. The crime was not committed with a weapon. It was committed with a pen. On November 24th, 1922, 7 men representing 7 states gathered in a hotel in Santa Fe, New Mexico. They were there to sign a document called the Colorado River Compact. Their goal was to divide the river's water, to allocate a resource they believed was vast and limitless, and to lay the legal groundwork for the growth of the American West. They assigned 7.5 million acre-feet of water per year to the upper basin states of Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico. They assigned another 7.5 million acre-feet to the lower basin of California, Arizona, and Nevada. Another 1.5 million acre-feet would later be guaranteed to Mexico by treaty in 1944. There was just one catastrophic flaw in their calculations. The water they were dividing up did not actually exist. The negotiators based their allocations on flow measurements, taken during one of the wettest periods in the last 1,200 years. They looked at a historic flood and called it the average. The true 21st century average flow of the Colorado River isn't 16 or 18 million acre-feet. It's closer to 12.4 million. They had created a system with a built-in deficit from day one. They signed a check that nature was never going to cash. For 100 years, that mathematical error has compounded, silently accumulating in the background, a debt passed down from one generation to the next. That debt is now being paid by the two largest savings accounts in the system, Lake Powell and Lake Mead. These are not lakes, not in the way nature makes lakes. They are reservoirs. Vast, artificial holding tanks created by two of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history, Glen Canyon Dam and Hoover Dam. They were designed to tame the river, to store its unpredictable spring floods and release the water in a controlled, orderly fashion for cities and farms. For decades, they did exactly that. They fueled the explosive growth of Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas. They turned desert valleys in Arizona and California into the winter vegetable basket for the entire nation, watering 5.5 million acres of farmland. They provided power and water to 30 tribal nations. They built a $1.4 trillion annual economy on the back of a single, overburdened river. But you cannot defy a mathematical error forever. The bathtub rings tell the story. Those stark white scars climbing the canyon walls of Lake Mead and Lake Powell are mineral deposits, a ghostly ledger marking every foot of water that has been lost and never replaced. They are a monument to a century of taking more than the river can give. And right now, those lakes are approaching a point of genuine system failure. The numbers are bleak. Let me know in the comments if you live in one of these 7 states, and if you're seeing water restrictions or other effects firsthand. Your experience on the ground is a critical part of this story. As of this summer, Lake Powell, the primary water bank for the Upper Basin, sits at an elevation of 3,526.55 feet. That is just 23.2% of its capacity. More importantly, it is only 36.5 feet above an elevation of 3,490 feet. That number is not arbitrary. 3,490 feet is the minimum power pool for Glen Canyon Dam. Below that level, the dam's turbines can no longer generate hydropower. More critically, the dam's river outlet works, the primary mechanism for sending water downstream to Lake Mead, begin to lose their ability to function. The dam physically cannot pass water downstream. It becomes a plug, a 37-foot buffer. That is the margin of error separating 40 million people from a legal and logistical catastrophe. Downstream, the situation is just as precarious. Lake Mead, the lifeblood of Las Vegas and a critical supply for Arizona and California, is at 1,044.61 feet. That is less than 10 feet above the 1,035-foot threshold where Hoover Dam's own turbines begin to lose efficiency, with many of the 17 units unable to generate power at all. The plunging water levels are not just a water supply problem anymore. They are an energy crisis waiting to happen. In June of this year, the Bureau of Reclamation authorized a $52 million request. Not for conservation, not for new supply, but to begin work on new, wide-head turbines for Hoover Dam. Turbines specifically designed to operate at lake elevations as low as 950 feet. It is an admission of defeat. It is a bet that the lake will continue to fall. They are not engineering for recovery. They are engineering for a future of unprecedented scarcity. This slow-motion crisis reached a breaking point in the summer of 2022. The reservoirs were falling faster than any model had predicted. The system was hemorrhaging water. On a June afternoon, the commissioner of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, a woman named Camille Kalamlim Tutin, stood before a Senate committee and delivered an ultimatum that sent shockwaves across the entire basin. She gave the 7 states just 60 days to come up with a voluntary plan to cut their water use by an unprecedented 2 to 4 million acre-feet. To put that number in perspective, 2 million acre-feet is more than the entire state of Arizona is legally entitled to in a year. It is nearly 7 times the annual allocation for the entire state of Nevada. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. If the states could not agree on how to make the cuts themselves, the federal government would do it for them. What followed was not cooperation. It was a political civil war. The deadline came and went with no agreement. The states fractured into 2 warring camps. The upper basin states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and New Mexico, argued that the lower basin, particularly California, had been overusing water for decades and should bear the brunt of the cuts. The lower basin states fired back, pointing to the complex and century-old system of water rights that gave them legal seniority. California, a state that consumes the single largest share of the river, took a particularly hard line. Their chief negotiator is a man named J.B. Hamby. When he was appointed chairman of the Colorado River Board of California in 2023, he was just 27 years old. He now represents the interests of the Imperial Irrigation District, a behemoth agricultural entity that holds some of the oldest and most powerful water rights on the entire river. Hamby's position has been clear. California has senior rights, and it will not voluntarily give them up without compensation and a clear, binding agreement that honors the existing law. It's a legally sound position that is colliding with a physically collapsing reality. Okay, I know this is the second time I'm asking, but it's important. An unbelievable number of people who watch these deep dives, people who clearly care about these issues, forget to subscribe. If you're getting value from this analysis, please hit that button. It's the only way we know to keep making them, and it tells the algorithm that this is a conversation worth having. And while you're at it, if you know someone in your family or a friend who needs to understand what's happening to the water in the West, share it with them. That helps more than you can possibly imagine. A like doesn't hurt either. All right, enough of that. Back to the fight. The result of this infighting is a dangerous paralysis. The federal government has threatened to impose its own cuts, a move that would undoubtedly trigger a cascade of lawsuits from all 7 states, locking the river's fate in the courts for years while the reservoirs continue to drain. Every state, as one expert put it, is waiting for someone else to sacrifice. But the river is done waiting, and all of this is unfolding under the shadow of a hard deadline. December 31st, 2026. On that day, the 2 most important legal documents managing the river are set to expire. The first is the 2007 Interim Guidelines, the rule book that dictates how shortages are declared and shared among the states. The second is an innovative and surprisingly successful binational agreement with Mexico called Minute 323. Both documents simply cease to exist at the stroke of midnight on New Year's Eve, 2026. If no replacement is in place, the management of the Colorado River will revert to a chaotic legal free-for-all, governed by century-old laws that were never designed for scarcity. It is a legal cliff, and the entire region is accelerating toward it, with no one at the wheel. But to understand what's truly at stake if those agreements fail, you have to travel south. South of the border, south of the dams, south of all the political bickering, to the place where the river is supposed to meet the sea. Because it's there, in the dry delta, that a small group of scientists and activists have proven that the opposite of collapse is still possible. It began with a radical idea. What if, instead of just taking water out, we intentionally put a little bit back? This was the genesis of Minute 319, a 2012 agreement between the U.S. and Mexico. It was a trailblazing amendment to the 1944 Water Treaty. For the first time, it treated the delta not as a drainage ditch, but as a legitimate water user with a right to exist. The centerpiece of the agreement was the pulse flow. On March 23, 2014, engineers opened the gates at Morelos Dam, the final diversion point on the river near the Arizona-Mexico border. For 8 weeks, a surge of life-giving water flowed into the parched riverbed. Photographer and filmmaker Pete McBride was there to document it. He followed the water on foot and by raft as it pushed through decades of dry sand. He saw Mexican villagers come to the riverbanks, some bringing their children to see a flowing river for the first time in their lives. The water wasn't a torrent. It was a slow, deliberate crawl, but it was moving. And on May 15th, 2014, for the first time in 16 years, the Colorado River kissed the salt of the Sea of Cortez. It was a fleeting connection, a temporary victory, but it was proof of concept. The patient was not entirely dead. The success of the pulse flow led to a more ambitious sequel, Minute 323, signed in 2017. This new agreement was more comprehensive. It committed the U.S. and Mexico to sharing shortages, meaning Mexico would take cuts alongside Arizona and Nevada when Lake Mead dropped. But in exchange, it also committed both countries to providing ongoing, strategic water deliveries for the Delta's environment through 2026. The goal wasn't just to make the river reach the sea for a day. It was to rebuild a functioning ecosystem from the ground up. A coalition of 6 nonprofits called Raise the River stepped in to manage the work. Led in Mexico by people like Aida Navarro, their teams identified key restoration sites within the dry delta. These weren't vast floodplains, but targeted zones where a small amount of water could have the biggest possible impact. Using the water allocated under Minute 323, they began irrigating these patches of land, clearing out invasive tamarisks, and planting native cottonwood and willow trees. Over 250,000 of them. The results, documented by a binational team of scientists co-led by Dr. Carl Flessa from the University of Arizona, are nothing short of miraculous. A 2024 report confirmed that these small, targeted water releases, a tiny fraction of the river's total flow, have successfully restored 1,381 acres of vibrant green habitat. Aida Navarro put it best. They've created a forest out of nothing. Well, out of water and a lot of hard work. Walking through these restoration sites is like stepping into another dimension. Outside their boundaries is the familiar cracked, barren delta. But inside, there is shade. There is the rustle of leaves. There is the sound of migratory birds. Over 380 species have been documented using these new oases, a more than 40% increase in abundance. The green corridor is so distinct, it's visible from space. And then came the real surprise: beavers. In a landscape that had been reduced to dry dirt, the return of a small, steady supply of water was enough to trigger their reappearance. The beavers built dams, creating small ponds that held the water on the landscape longer, recharging the local groundwater and creating even more wetland habitat. Their engineering amplified the human restoration effort. Soon after, signs of bobcats and coyotes began appearing, drawn to the water and the prey that came with it. An entire food web was stitching itself back together. Dr. Carl Flessa summarized the findings with a sense of wonder. The lessons learned from more than a decade of work show that a small amount of water can do big things, he stated. It's really quite remarkable how a little bit of water can go a long way in the Colorado River Delta. This is the hope. This is the proof that even a system on the brink of collapse can be pulled back. Even a landscape pronounced dead can harbor the memory of life, waiting for the right conditions to reemerge. But all of it, every single acre of restored forest, every returning bird, every beaver dam, is dependent on Minute 323. The agreement that provides the water. The agreement that expires on December 31st, 2026. This is the agonizing paradox of the Colorado River today. In the north, at the negotiating tables in dusty conference rooms, 7 states are locked in a zero-sum battle for a shrinking supply, paralyzed by a century of flawed assumptions. Political gridlock threatens to push the entire system off a legal and hydrological cliff. In the south, a handful of scientists and conservationists have provided a clear, working model for resilience and recovery, proving that even a small investment in the river's health yields astonishing returns. The path forward seems obvious, but it requires a fundamental shift in thinking. It requires U.S. water managers to view water sent to the Delta not as a loss, but as an investment in the stability of the entire system. A healthy delta helps push back tidal saltwater intrusion that can contaminate coastal aquifers. It provides a buffer. It is a critical piece of the regional water security puzzle, not just a charity project. This perspective is slowly gaining traction. A new agreement, Minute 330, was signed in March 2024. Under this deal, the U.S. will invest $65 million in Mexican water infrastructure. In exchange, Mexico has agreed to leave an additional 400,000 acre-feet of water in the system by 2026, water that will help prop up the dangerously low levels in Lake Mead. Some of that money will go to paying farmers in the Mexicali Valley not to grow crops, leaving their water allocation in the river. It's a creative, if counterintuitive solution, paying people to save water for the benefit of everyone. But these are temporary patches, stopgap measures. They are small, innovative agreements happening in the shadow of the colossal failure to agree on the big picture, the post-2026 operating guidelines. What does the future look like if they fail? What happens if the clock runs out? Eric Balkin, the executive director of the Glen Canyon Institute, put it bluntly: there's only so much water that can be shuffled around. Eventually, every state will have to make a sacrifice. Without a new agreement, the Secretary of the Interior may be forced to impose draconian cuts based on the federal government's interpretation of water law. That scenario would almost certainly favor tribes with senior water rights and cities over agriculture, which consumes nearly 80% of the river's flow. It would ignite a legal firestorm that could destabilize the food supply for the entire country, which relies on the Imperial and Yuma valleys for 90% of its winter vegetables. The story of the Colorado River has become a story of 2 possible futures, running in parallel. One is a future of conflict, litigation, and collapse, where reservoirs hit dead pool, power grids fail, and a multi-trillion-dollar economy grinds to a halt. The other is a future of cooperation, innovation, and resilience, modeled on the quiet, stunning success of the Delta restoration. A future where we recognize that a river is more than a plumbing system, and that its health is inextricably linked to our own. The choice between those 2 futures will be made in the next 2 years. The clock that started ticking in 1922 is now in its final minutes. The river itself has shown it has the capacity for rebirth. The open question is whether we do. The engineering has taken us as far as it can. The dams have been built. The canals have been dug. Now, the solution will not be found in concrete